good to see each of you, and I get a chance to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is development, especially in younger children, and getting to that sooner versus later, so we can get great outcomes and great kids. And so I'm going to take you through that today. I'm going to use a theme. I'm much older than y'all, so some of you will recognize, I won't say some, maybe one of you other than me might recognize this movie. They did do a remake of it in 2020. It was called The Right Stuff. And so today I'm going to talk about the right development. And I'm going to spend time giving you a little bit about development and some things to look for. Then we're going to talk about those best practices and things you can do. I've given our moderator authority. Please, if you have questions, if you would put them in the chat, and she's going to notify me, and we will try to answer those as we go through. Because as I've already implied, I'm an old dinosaur at this, and so I can't wait 50 minutes to 45 minutes to get a question answered, because I will have forgotten it unless I write it down. So I don't want that to happen to y'all today. I want this to be something that is really useful and helpful. And on that note, oh boy, there we go. This movie came out in October of 1983. And as I said, there was a remake of it in 2020, and there's actually a series on it. But it was about the Mercury 7 astronauts, in particular, Chuck Yeager, Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gus Grisham, and Gordon Cooper. And the whole gist of the movie is they really, they had to overcome a lot of things, not just in space, but the environment beforehand. But they were made of the right stuff. And the right stuff helped them to overcome those things and have a successful mission. And so I co-opted their theme, because if we get to children early and identify that they might be having issues, we can give them the right stuff to overcome their developmental disability or help with their disability. And if we get to them early enough, i.e. birth to 3, we might change their whole potential. So that's the gist, is to get people really familiar with the things to look for in children. So I'm going to, again, talk to you some about what development is. I'm going to give you a quick course. I call it Development 101. I'm going to talk to you about the right tools to use, the best practices, some of the resources and places to go. And then I'm going to show you a little evidence about why it's the right stuff, that it really gets kids what they need. Okay, the right time, Development 101. For small children, we have a set of milestones or benchmarks, if you will, that all children are supposed to get to. And they usually get to it at a certain time. And they don't have to have models, and they don't have to have a lot of input. If they're developing normally, they will get to these milestones. Now, sometimes if they have abuse or neglect, they don't reach those milestones on time. Or if they have a developmental disability, they might not reach those milestones on time. But that's what we use. We have to gauge where they are. And we look at 5 different areas. One is their gross motor. That's how they move their arms and legs. If they walk, they sit up for small babies, they crawl, they pull up on furniture, and then they start walking. Then it's running and going up and down stairs and jumping. All that is gross motor. Fine motor is using their small muscles. They're balancing. They use their fingers. For small babies, it's taking a Cheerio and putting it in a bowl or a bottle with their index finger and their thumb. As they get older, it's scribbling on paper, drawing circles first, and then triangles, and then squares and diamonds. As they get older, it's cutting on a dotted line, is coloring between the line. All that is fine motor. Then we have language. And there are two types of language that we look at. One is called their expressive language, what the child says. By two, every child should have 100 words, and putting together 2 to 3 word phrases, and it goes up from there. We have a benchmark here that by 2, you should be able, as a stranger, to understand 50% of what a child says. By 3, 75%, and by 4, 100%. So children with articulation issues and expressive language problems, sometimes we don't see that. So we look at their language. We also look at something called receptive language, what a child understands. If I'm talking to a child, if I'm giving a child a command, is that child able to do it? And as they developmentally go along, they should be able to do it. Now, some of us as parents have had those children that have had sometimes selective hearing and selective skills in seeming to understand what they're being told or what they're being asked. But for the most part, children seem to understand, and they pick up on, you start out with simple commands, and as they get older, you give them more multi-step commands. Cognitively, we look at how children problem solve. We look at whether or not they're doing some task on time. Can they solve puzzles? Can they sequence things? What their memory is like. All that's in the cognitive side. We usually don't go around giving, in particular, small children the IQ test that you might be familiar with, but we do have ways to figure out whether or not a child is cognitively on time. We usually know that by what the child does. We definitely have ways to evaluate that. They're social emotional. That's a really important thing, and especially in light of the fact that autism has really come on the scene, and it's very much in our communities. How a child smiles, if they follow you with their eyes, if they make good eye contact with you, if they will go back and forth with you or engage around a toy, around a favorite activity, around a person, around an activity such as hide and seek and tickling, and that's all social emotional, and that's really important to take a look at as well. So these are the 5 areas. We know the kids should be doing things at a certain time period in all these areas, and if they are not, that's when we start referring them or monitoring them more closely to make sure they get to these benchmarks or milestones. On the social emotional side, we look at stages of development, and most people don't know things like trust and autonomy. All that comes really early. Trust comes before age 1, and most of you might have thought that trust would come around the teenage years. It certainly continues developing, but it starts early. Babies depend on you to engage with them when they're crying and see about what they need. If it's being picked up and being held, if it's being changed, if it's being fed, babies know that. And Eric Erickson, a psychologist, developed these stages so we could really determine whether or not a kid was developing properly. And again, it starts out early on. If babies cry and you come and check on them and give them what they need, then they develop bonds, they develop trust. If you don't, if that doesn't happen for them, then the basis of which they would form trust gets skewed or gets really out of whack, and they can start forming some really atypical relationships. We call them attachment disorders. They attach in a way that you wouldn't expect. So it's really, really important that from the start, we give babies things that will help them continue to develop. Autonomy, we've all seen this. If we have children, that comes early. That comes between 1 to 2 years of age. And you start seeing things like, me do it, or I do it, or I can do it, or I want this, I don't need your help. They don't say that, but they'll push you away. They'll go out and they'll explore, and then they'll come back to you. That's autonomy, and that happens early on. If we don't give them the right environments, or we mistreat them, then we might impact their self-confidence and their ability to regulate and control themselves. The ideal of initiative comes early too, starts at age 2, and it helps them really try to start things and to attempt to engage in activities. And impulse control and imagination comes as a part of this stage. And again, if the child is maltreated, child abuse, or if they have a disability even, they might not be good at recognizing limits, and they might not be too independent. So we know, if you look at these things, we know whether or not a child is developing well. There's a way that we can look at children's intellectual and psychosocial development. And most of you have heard about Piaget. Piaget looked at cognitive development, and he did that. Again, we don't do IQ testings for babies by having them identify a lot of things, or work puzzles, or identify pictures necessarily. What we do for them is we see what they do. And before age 2, from birth to 2, we see babies go from reflexes to intentional actions. They learn cause and effect. They learn object permanence, i.e., if the baby is usually between birth and 6 months, if you stick your finger in their hand, their fingers will automatically overlap your finger. And I know new parents just love this. They think, oh, my baby knows me, and my baby loves me, and is holding on to me. Yeah, that I tell them, yep, that's right. But honestly, it's a reflex. And if the baby is developing properly, the baby will do that. Same thing, many of you, if you've had young children, have seen a startle reflex. If there's a loud noise, if there's a sudden movement, the baby may startle. All of those are reflexes to sort of help the baby early on. And as the baby grows, things start getting more attentional, i.e., around 10 months, you can play hide and seek usually with the baby, because the baby is going to recognize that if you put your hands up over your face, that you're still there. Your face is still there. Or if you put an object, one of their toys, under a blanket, they will probably reach for that blanket to get the toy. That's object permanence, and that comes usually around 10 months. And so babies begin to recognize, oh, this happens, so this happens. And that's in the sensory period. Also, the pre-operational period comes between 2 and 7. There goes the speech. I do it, me do it. Children become more social. They start telling you things. They start engaging around toys usually. They go from simple play to more symbolic play. They will imitate. Maybe you're doing housework or washing the car or mowing the yard. They really start both imitating and just being able to play. Again, it's going from what were somewhat simple actions to very intentional, sometimes really mirroring what they see. Okay. If we start looking at things, we realize pretty quickly that developmental disabilities is still increasing, unfortunately. And between 1997 and 2008, the CDC did a major study looking at children's development. And they found that 13.87%, so 14 children out of 1,000 kids, if you will, had a developmental disability. So here we go with the best practices. We already know from the start that every child is not going to develop normally. So what we have to do is find these children early. They're not going to raise their hand and say, I have atypical development. They're going to start doing things or not doing things. And then we as adults have to recognize, okay, that's not quite what we expect, or he's not doing, or she's not doing what we would expect. She's not talking on time. She doesn't seem to make eye contact. She's not bringing me things or pointing. All those things we recognize that children weren't being able to do. And we also recognize that incidence, if you will, of children was going up. So most states at that point start developing early intervention programs to go out and try to find these children early. Again, if we find them between birth and 3, we can really change things. Early intervention is tried and true, is a best practice. It's been proven. So that's part of our job if we're working with small kids, is to figure out who's developing typically and who's not. And you see learning disabilities have gone up, ADHD prevalence has gone up, and developmental delay or global delay, intellectual disability, that stayed sort of the same. But the CDC looked again in 2014, and they found that the prevalence of a child aged 3 to 17 that was ever diagnosed with a disability had increased from 5.7 to 6.99%. They also noticed that males were likely more than females to have a developmental disability and intellectual disability and autism. ASD is autism, ID is intellectual disability, and DD is developmental disability compared to females. So we see it more in males. Hispanic children overall had a lower prevalence of developmental disabilities than any other race. And the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder is ASD, and intellectual disability did not really change very much. Now, you can say, Dr. Pinnock, but I've heard things like ASD was one in, when I got out of residency in 1989, it was 1 in 10,000. And last year, the CDC numbers were 1 in 54. So things have changed as a matter of fact in that autism overall has gone up. But we'll discuss that a little more as we go along. Well, we're already to discussing it. I call these the big A's. These are two very common neurodevelopmental disabilities that children have, and you will see that the children don't quite develop what we would expect them to be. One is ADHD. We see quite a bit of that. We now have the capacity to even look at adults. Generally, this is not a curable disease. Things get better as children age. They get more interested in things they are drawn to, and hopefully they get more jobs and vocations that are in areas they're interested in, so the attention can be held. Sometimes that's not true, and adults have lots of problems, in particular with their vocation, with their relationships, with their extracurricular activities. Same for autism. Autism spectrum disorder is really out there, and I know you don't have most of your cameras on, but will you just put in the chat, raise your hand if you know of somebody with autism spectrum disorder? Caitlin, what does it look like?
We have 3 yeses so far.
Okay. When I first started asking that question, if I asked that question in an audience, maybe somewhere between 10 to 25% of the folks would raise their hands. Over the last 5 to 10 years, I've noted if I ask that question, as many as 50 to 75% of the folks raise their hand, that they know somebody personally with autism. That is how that incidence has changed. If we let's look first at ADHD. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual on Mental Health Disorders gives us the criteria. It was last upgraded in 2013, and there are 2 types of ADHD. There's one type with inattention, and there you see some of those symptoms. The person has to have 6 of the 9 symptoms, and you see things like schoolwork, chores, duties in the workplace. So now we can also examine adults and young adults. They have to have 5 of the 9 symptoms. And then there's the hyperactivity impulsive type. And again, the symptoms have to be present for more than 6 months. They have to be present at least by age 12 if they're an adult. If there's a child, usually it's by age 7 that you see those. And you see some of the common symptoms with that: fidgeting, leaving their seat, running around the class. You see things as when they are adults, trouble engaging. All of those are symptoms. On the impulsive side, they're blurting out answers, difficulty waiting turn, interrupting. You definitely probably have seen someone with ADHD. Symptoms, don't go around trying to diagnose your spouse or your significant other, please. Don't tell them Dr. Pinnock said, okay, you do all these things, you have ADHD. But ADHD is a very common, as a matter of fact, the most common neurodevelopmental disorder. And we look at those symptoms. One of the things that we note about those symptoms is they have to occur in more than one place. So if you have ADHD symptoms only at school, it's probably not ADHD. It's probably a learning disability. If you have ADHD only at home, it's not ADHD. It's probably a social matter or a temperament matter or a personality mismatch. It can be lots of things, but it has to occur in two places. It has to impair function, and it really it has to have occurred a long time. So let me just give you a for instance. If you had a child that was doing really well in school and you took that child to a more rigorous school and that kid started having issues, it's probably not ADHD. It might even be depression. When a child goes from a change in environment like that, sometimes the rigor and the new structure is so intense for them, it really depresses them. And so it's really important when you look at these things and to know the difference, because if a child is depressed and you give them a stimulant medicine, which is the most common ones we give for ADHD, you can make their depression worse. So these are not diagnoses that we should hand out as providers. We should be comprehensive in looking, and if you've tried to have your child or somebody else you know assessed, you should be given screens or assessment tools that you can write down what you see, and the teacher should have that input. And if the kid is in sports or at church school and stuff, the personnel over the child should have some input. So you can see, is this occurring in all these places, or is it just happening in one place? There's some other assessments we do, something called EPSDT. If you're a provider, you know what that is. It's early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment. It's the well visit, if you will. It was given that name in particular for kids that are served with Medicaid as their insurance. EPSDT is the well child visits, the same thing. Happens the same time if you have commercial insurance for your child. It should be at 2 weeks, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, coincides with usually when the child gets an immunization or their vaccines early on. So these things happen. We're monitoring children. Also, as a part of that, it's comprehensive. It has a standardized developmental tool, which is one of those best practices. Those screening tests that you can have parents or daycare workers or babysitters fill out and get the information. It also has things like the height and weight, and you can figure out the BMI or body mass index, which is helpful if you're trying to see if a child has a healthy weight or is getting taller or more obese than they need to be. Those screening tests look at developmental milestones and whether or not a child is meeting those. It also looks at behavior, mainly engagement and things like back and forth and eye contact. There are also some other tests that look at like how the child is moving or making those milestones. So we use things like occupational therapy and physical therapy tests to make sure if we think the child might be delayed in that or not doing things well, we use those tests and then subsequent therapy to hopefully get the child back to relating and doing things at grade and age level. And then there are things like kindergarten readiness tests, things like knowing letters and being able to count and being able to write their numbers and write their names. And Those are all things that we use and assessments we use to see if children are developing properly. Going back to ADHD, I think I got my slides out of order, but there you see, again, the kids usually will have one or the other types. They will have impairment in symptoms in 2 settings. And speaking of the impairment, it has to stop the child from being able to do what they need to do. I.e., if you have a child that's really fidgety in class, but that child is making A's and acing all their assessments and doing well, they probably don't have ADHD. They might have boredom and need to be more academically challenged, but their fidgetiness and their not paying attention is not impairing their school performance. And so that's when you really have to look. It is a matter of impairment, not just the symptoms. Autism spectrum disorder. I'm talking to you about it because you're going to see it. You might see people in your workplace that you're concerned about. You might have significant others. For the most part, children with autism grow up to be adults with autism, and most of them have a very normal age span. There's nothing in autism that makes a child or a person die early, necessarily. So you're going to see persons with autism everywhere. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, changed things a little. We used to have 3 categories, now we just have 2. And one of the things that I've already implied to you is that incidence is increasing. And you really know that to be true. You're probably seeing things on television, and we hear about it. Different actors and actresses have children on the spectrum and they talk about it. Probably one of the things we've heard most about it was a researcher that falsified information and tied autism to the measles, mumps, and rubella shot over in London. And from his doing that has caused so much issue in children being properly vaccinated. And even some of that is poured into, and I think we're going to see it when vaccinations for COVID come out for children. We will just have parents that won't do it. And some of that angst has been caused by the misinformation and what that researcher initially did. So in our setting, we're going to see kids that are on the spectrum. And it's called the spectrum because the kids will have the symptoms in the 2 areas I'm getting ready to tell you about, but it might look different. And I can tell you, I know of several families now that have 2 or 3 children on the spectrum in the same family, and they all display those symptoms of autism differently. So it is a spectrum, but kids still have the symptoms. And here are what it looks like. Children with autism have deficits in their social interactions and communications. And when I say social interactions, it's things like going back and forth, it's eye contact, it's being able to have a verbal or nonverbal interaction about something. Kids on the spectrum don't do that as much. And you can say, well, Dr. Pinnock, that kid looked at me, that kid smiled once, but the kid is 6 years old. I would expect a child 6 to do a lot more of that. So the measurement is not that they don't absolutely do that. It's do they do it at their age limit? Do they do it like other 6-year-olds would do it? And that's what usually throws people off, because they'll see a kid smile or occasionally look at you and say, he can't have autism, she can't have autism. Oh, yes, they can. If they're not doing things at their age level for that interaction, they most certainly can. So knowing that their social interactions are below age level, knowing their communication skills are below age level. The most common thing we see is delayed expressive language. The child won't talk it to. The child doesn't have 100 words in putting together 2 to 3 word phrases. That usually comes for most children on the spectrum around 2.5 or 3. And some kids as late as even 4 and 5. And we also see a pattern if the child was actually talking early, talking between 12 months and 18 months, but at about 2 or 2.5, the child stops talking and maybe won't really say words again until they're 4 or till they're 5. So when we see that pattern, we start getting suspicious, and especially if the child has some of the other things I'm going to talk to you about. And it's not just expressive language, it's the nonverbal things too. If you notice, small children can't talk. So how do they tell you things? They point, they'll take you to them, they'll bring things to you, and it asks you to engage if they're toys, get you to open it, whatever. Kids can talk long before they start talking, but kids on the spectrum tend to not do that as well either. They're not pointing as well. If you say, John, look at that, John may or may not look. And depending on if John is interested in what you pointed at, they will keep going and doing whatever it was they're doing. So those are the social interactions in the communication deficits. Then there's the second area. It's the repetitive behaviors and restricted interests. Kids, that's just like it says, the definition of those words. If kids, and I call it get obsessed with things. If Johnny has an obsession with SpongeBob and Johnny is typically developing, Johnny doesn't have autism. If Johnny has an obsession with SpongeBob and Johnny talked a year later and Johnny is walking on his toes and Johnny is not pointing, Johnny probably has autism. So it's those restricted interests. Often little kids, in particular boys, dinosaurs, trains. Thomas the Train was, and Barney the dinosaur. Man, when those characters came out, almost every kid, in particular male kid with autism that came through my office seemed to just be enthralled with that. Recently, I don't know if you've heard the Baby Shark song. I have a lot of little kids come in my office singing Baby Shark, much usually to the parents' consternation, because they probably heard that over and over all day, every day. So it's those kind of things, those restricted interests, those repetitive behaviors, rocking, spinning. I examined a child on Tuesday. He likes to twirl strings. He just twirls strings all day long. Twirling, flipping lights on and off, turning the water on and off, running back and forth, pacing, jumping up and down, climbing on furniture. All of those are repetitive behaviors. Again, if you just had a repetitive behavior and none of the other things I talked to you about, probably not autism. But if you have a repetitive behavior, you talk late, you're not communicating like you would think verbally or non-verbally. And the other thing is we see sometimes atypical sensory responses. So you don't like loud noises, although you can be very loud. You don't like certain smells that don't really bother other people. You sniff your food, and if the food doesn't smell like you need it to smell, you won't eat it. You have texture problems, so you really probably are a picky eater. You'll eat some things, but you won't eat others. You don't like certain clothes, i.e. if the clothes are really tight on you, you won't wear them. You won't wear blue jeans because it's stiff material. I had a young man who didn't like long pants. So he lived in Nashville, Tennessee. And if you know anything about Nashville, around November stuff or so, we start having cold weather. Well, his mom would fight with him essentially every morning to put long pants on when it was 30 degrees and below. So I ended up contracting with him to get him a PlayStation game. If he agreed, if the weather was 30, if it was below 30, and he was very astute and could tell you, he would have to wear his long pants. And if the weather was over 30, he could wear his short pants. But it's that kind of sensory issue. Don't like to be touched, putting things in their mouth, especially if they're older. All of those things are what we see in the kids. And I'm gonna move us forward because you have those, but the whole gist of this, the whole reason I even spent time in trying to help you understand about these is because we need to get kids to the right places. We need to use the right tools to do that. And one of the things the American Academy of Pediatrics said, we should look for these kids and we should have certain time periods that we look. So that's what the developmental surveillance start happening at those times that your kids go in for those well child visit or those EPSDT visits. They should have a standardized developmental assessment so we can look and see. And that should happen every time they go in for a well child visit. So as you can imagine, we start picking up more and more children because we were looking. And children should get standardized screening at certain times, at 9 months, at 18 months, and at 30 months. They get certain screenings. And if all the children get that, not just kids that you have questions about, but all the children get that, you start picking up kids early on that might have an issue. One of the things, and when I'm teaching students, I call it the just do it, the no-brainers. One thing they found out way back in the 80s, if you used a standardized tool, you could pick up 7 to 8 out of 10 children. If you used a standardized tool, you could pick up 8 to 9 out of 10 children with mental health issues. The whole reason, though, is you got to use the standardized tool. It's the no-brainer. If you don't use the standardized tool, if you try to use just your judgment and your training, guess what? You miss it 7 to 8 out of 10 times, or you miss it 8 to 9 out of 10 times. So is the Nike brand, just do it, do it. That's what you have to do. Those standardized screening tools, I've put several of them. I'm not going to go into any detail, but we do have assessments out there that we can assess children at every time they have a well child visit to see whether or not they're developing properly. Some of the other best practices other than developmental surveillance is developmental monitoring. So say I have a kid come in at 12 months and they're not doing what they need on the gross motor side. They're not pulling up, they're not looking like they're getting ready to walk anytime soon. So I give them the standardized test. They fail the test in the gross motor area. Developmental monitoring says that, you know, maybe the child is going to get their shots 6 months from now. Well, 6 months is a fairly long time period. Maybe I'm going to bring that child in a month and see if the child is moving more toward that milestone of walking, or once a month to check their development. At 15 months, if the kid almost runs in my office, you know, other than maybe inconvenience the parents to come in 3 times and the kid, what have I lost? But say at 14 months, that child's not making any of those inroads, I can refer that kid to physical therapy. And who knows, by 18 months, maybe the kid's running into my office. So that's what monitoring is. That's what looking at kids and trying to see. And if you have a question and you can see the kid often, monitor. If you might not see this kid again until the kid got sick, refer the kid that day. The kid failed, the standardized tool is not doing what they need, you know. Much rather, by the time most kids, when I say refer, you're referring to the likes of developmental behavioral pediatrician or psychologist or psychiatrist. Usually you don't get appointments the next day. And so by the time the kid is going for their appointment, which is usually a couple of months out, they might be doing what they need, or they might not, and you would have made the right referral. So my encouragement is just do it, make those referrals. There needs to be some community awareness, and I put that from a tribal viewpoint from families. You know, it might not even be from the mom and dad. It might be the grandparents that recognize the child is not doing what they need to do. But whoever has the knowledge and can point that out, we need to rally around that and get the child to the right place. And I call them screening at events. Around here in Nashville, we like health fairs, but a lot of the things, in particularly the early intervention folks do, is they have screenings at health fairs. They help the adults and they help the children at that point. But that's what we call it, a convenience sample. You can have 100-200 people all come with kids of all ages, and you can do a screening, and you can tell the parent right then and there whether or not you think the child has an issue. Most of these screening tools you can do in 5 minutes, y'all. 5 minutes, and you can change somebody's life. It doesn't get too much better than that. And I don't know what kind of providers y'all are, but changing somebody's kidney function and changing somebody's diabetes and heart disease, all that's good. But changing a kid's development and their trajectory, I say we beat that hands down every time. So I'm just going to be biased, just chalk it up to my long experience. Changing a kid's outlook is some of the best practice you could ever do. So, and you don't have to be a doc to do it. You can be the grandmother, you can be the aunt, you can be the good friend that's always around the parent, but you see the kid and you know something is different. So that's what I wanted to tell you. There are websites out there for parents and teachers. Things like CHAD for ADD has had great content for about 3 decades now for both teachers and parents if you have a child with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And Autism Speaks is a parent advocacy group, and it's a national group. It has state and local chapters, and it has great content. You can go to the websites, you can find out things for home, for sport, for the classrooms. These websites are great with having lots of input and information, and most of it's free content. There's a 100-day toolkit if your child has autism. So what to do in those first 100 days when you're trying to get your child's services or get to the right person. So again, that's helpful. Most states have early intervention services and what we call child find. They usually happen for kids birth to 3 years of age. And what's nice about it is they usually deliver the services to the child's home, which is really neat for parents. And so taking advantage of that, especially if you see a child under the age of 3 that is not developing well. Usually after age 3 or at 3, the local education agency is the one responsible for giving services, and that's from 3 all the way to 21. So if a child has a special need, and we follow the federal guidelines for things like an individualized education plan, the kid can get what they need in school. So these are tried and true best practices for real, have great track records. They're there. So why did I spend all this time trying to tell you that? Because if we miss kids with developmental disabilities early, we cost them and their parents up to $100,000 to get them in the right place. But if we get to them early and we change that trajectory, these kids, we followed them, and there have been 3 major studies that followed some of these kids for 25 plus years. They didn't get pregnant in high school. They had jobs and good paying jobs. They didn't get usually involved in the criminal justice system, and they graduated from high school. So here's what you do when we do the right stuff. When we do the right stuff, guess what? We get the right stuff. So any questions? I've talked a lot. I didn't leave much time for questions. I'm sorry. I'll try to answer all of the questions in 6 minutes. Either I bored y'all to death, or I confused you, or nothing, Miss Caitlin?
I don't see anything right now.
Okay.
I had a question though. What's the connection between walking on your toes and autism?
That's a great. The real connection is if they're doing the other things, that becomes a repetitive behavior versus maybe a gross motor issue. Sometimes kids have issues with their ankles and stuff, and they'll walk on their toes, or they have tight muscles around their ankles and stuff, and they'll walk on their toes. So it's developmentally, it's not uncommon. You usually send the kid to an orthopedic surgeon or so to look at that, or a physical therapist most of the time to look at that. But if a kid is walking on their toes and they have all those other signs of autism, it's more repetitive behavior.
Gotcha. I've always
I met a child Tuesday that walked on his knees until he was 3 years old. So these kids do some very different things.
Yeah.
So.
Got it.
Any other questions? Got some encouragement for you. Mother Teresa was asked when she was pulling folks out of the gutter in Calcutta, how could she keep doing that? Because every time she pulled one out, there were at least 100 more in their place. And she said, God doesn't call us to be successful. God calls us to be faithful. So if you pull out one and you change their trajectory, you can feel good about that. And this one comes from myself and Winston Churchill. Never have so many needed so much from so few. So if you start seeing that a kid is not developing well, point it out, take a chance. And let me just tell you all an encouraging story. My youngest child at about 11 months was not saying anything. And she had the great misfortune to have an older sister that was saying mama and daddy by 8 months. So, you know, I'm the developmentalist. I'm trying not to compare my kids. You know, like, oh, sister's talking. I'm trying not to make all those mistakes I talk about. And so I said, well, I can just ignore this kid. And at 15 months, she's still not babbling or saying any words. Then I'm going to be, we're not sending our child to that developmentalist because she couldn't even pick it up in her own kid. So I called TEIS, as Early Intervention Services here, and I told them that, and they were going to come out, and 3 weeks later they came out. Well, Vanessa came to the door and she asked them to come in and asked them how they were doing. And you know, the lady said, what child was that you wanted us to see? I said, this is the one. We've had a lot of language that has happened in the 3 weeks. I said, I know, I am a developmental pediatrician. I am competent, but this child was not talking before 3 weeks ago. I called you. And so Vanessa entertained her for sure. She shook my hand and said, you know, your baby's doing okay. And then the joke around our house, and especially when Vanessa used words that were much above her age level, my husband would turn to me and say, well, should we call TEIS now? So, you know, who cares? I can be the butt of the jokes in my family. My baby was assessed. I saw an issue early and I reached out early. And that's what I want y'all to do. If it was a mistake, great. That baby's developing, great. Vanessa is now a sophomore in college. And she has a lot of those, we call them $100 words in our household. She'll hit you with a few, and I'll look at her and say, okay, you said that. You think I don't know what it means, but I got you, young lady. But just to tell you, it's worth doing. It's worth even being wrong. That's a great thing to be wrong about. But if you're right, if the kid is having an issue and you get them there early, you'll make a difference. You'll change their lives. So thank you very much for your attention. And I hopefully said something that would be helpful to you in your practice and using the best practice. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us.